Hi everybody. Earlier today, I interviewed two of my favourite clients, Linda Capper and Andy Jeffries. Both of these good folk work for the British Antarctic Survey. Now, I love working with the British Antarctic Survey. I get to facilitate a 2-day workshop with them once a year. I've done that over the last 4 years, and I have seen huge changes, but I've been tracking this project that's been in the news recently, the launch of their new polar research vessel. Andy, in fact, is the project manager and Linda is the head of communications. Now, this interview turned out to be very rich, but I have a huge admiration for the British Antarctic Survey anyway. The more I learn about them, the more I understand that polar research, particularly Antarctic polar research, is probably the nearest any of us can get to space travel, to working in a hostile environment like space travel without actually leaving the surface of the planet. These people are heroes, and they pull off huge amounts of positive gain for the world with sometimes quite few resources. So here with me today are Linda Capper, Head of Communications at the British Antarctic Survey, and Andy Jeffries, also of the British Antarctic Survey, who is the Programme Manager for the Royal Research Ship Sir David Attenborough. And I'm really pleased to have these two guys with me. Welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi.
Good morning, Patrick.
Great. Can I start with you, Linda? Tell me a little bit about the story behind RRS Sir David Attenborough and why it's so important to you.
So the Royal Research Ship, the Sir David Attenborough, is a very exciting piece of scientific infrastructure that's currently under construction at Camel Laird shipyard in Birkenhead. It's a £200 million investment that will transform how the UK conducts science in the polar regions.
Right.
It will replace our two current ships, the James Clark Ross and the Ernest Shackleton, which are coming to the end of their operational lives. So I'm sure Andy will say more about this, but in the early planning stages of this project, we took the opportunity to do a strategic review of whether we needed to continue with two ships or one ship. So the option was to choose one ship which was much larger, had more advanced scientific capabilities, and would perform its role in the Antarctic and the Arctic. So it will transform how British Antarctic Survey performs its operations in the polar regions, and we have a parallel project looking at our whole operating dynamic at the moment.
Okay, I remember the discussion around one ship and two ships. Please feel free to chip in here, Andy, but Linda, it seems a bit to me like downsizing.
Well, it's kind of upsizing because it's a much bigger ship. It just means that we do things differently. We've got lots of new technologies coming on stream that are deployed from the ship, but also on the ice. And British Antarctic Survey and the Natural Environment Research Council are looking at the whole piece and trying to create a scientific capability for the future. We'll be heading towards a lot of automated technologies, which means we would require less ship time, perhaps to relieve some of the stations. We might have fewer people in the future. All of this is under discussion at the moment, but the long-term view is to reduce our environmental footprint, and one ship is better than two from that perspective, but also to be able to have more scientists on board conducting multi and interdisciplinary cruises at the same time, so becoming more efficient in how we deliver polar science.
I guess the bigger historical picture is that for a small nation like Britain, we've had a huge impact on research in the polar regions. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, the UK is one of the original 12 signatories from the Antarctic Treaty, which came into force in 1961, that designated Antarctica as a continent for peace and science. And we'd had a long history in Antarctica anyway, going back to the days of Captain Cook, who first navigated the continent, and then Scott and Shackleton, which are figures familiar to most people in our country. And over decades, there's been huge advances in research. The heroic age, if you like, was looking at what was there. People didn't really know much about the continent. And as we progressed through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we were starting to find out about how the Earth's plates moved and the role that Antarctica played in all of that. There was once a huge supercontinent called Gondwana, which South America, India, US were all connected to. And so we've learned a lot from this place that appears to be barren, uninhabited, at the bottom of the world. The Southern Ocean that surrounds it is cold. It's fed cold water from the melting ice that goes into the sea. That drives the global ocean circulation. It keeps the planet cool. The ice cap reflects the heat from the sun back into the atmosphere. So Antarctica plays a critical role in the well-being of everyone on Earth. And the scientific endeavours that have occurred there over decades, Britain has led a leading role in that. So we keep going on from strength to strength, and we're looking at what are the next decades of discovery in Antarctica, if you like. But it's science in Antarctica is international, it's collaborative. Each of the nations who are signed up to the Antarctic Treaty, and there is something close to 40 to 50 now, work together in partnership, looking at the different disciplines and sharing results to advance knowledge of the world.
We could go deeper into this, and I'm fascinated by the connections that we now realize that we have with this apparently remote and hostile place. But could I just turn to you, Andy, and ask you, okay, so you are managing a pretty big and complex project. What are the main challenges for you in delivering this £200 million project to your customer's satisfaction? And who is your customer?
Well, first of all, I can say who the customer is. I mean, it's there's really two main customers for the ship. There are the UK scientists, and then there's the guys and the girls who operate the ship. So the operator. So it's in some ways, it's quite an unusual project that you've got two kind of key stakeholders that aren't necessarily all in alignment with each other. So actually there is some, let's say antagonism between those two sets of, or let's say tension between those two sets of stakeholders, which makes it quite an interesting project to start with. I think it's quite a big question. What are the challenges? I think I'd start by saying it's a 7-year project, which we're in year 5 already. So we've already been through a lot of the challenges already. So I could go into detail, but you can imagine that starting off the project was quite a challenge. So initiating it, setting up the governance structure, and then you're moving into what is your procurement strategy? How do we go about procuring a state-of-the-art research vessel to a worldwide tender? And then the various stages you can imagine going through. So it has been a big challenge, but I think you need to break it down into phases to understand what the challenges were and how it's changed as we've gone through.
I could be cynical for a moment as a fellow project manager and say, Andy, that project managers will never agree that the project's truly over. But I saw it launch last month. You must be over the worst of it.
I think so, but I think the lessons we've learned from previous projects is that I think when I started work for NERC in 2008,
Sorry, who are NERC? Could you explain?
So that's the Natural Environment Research Council, who is the parent organisation for British Antarctic Survey. So they basically commissioned the ship to be built. And I've worked for them for 10 years, so this is my second ship that I've worked on. And I think the lesson we learned from that project was that when the project is delivered, so let's say you sign the contract with the shipyard and say this is delivered, our project team was dissolved at that point. And that was one of the big lessons we learned, that the real problems came after that, actually bringing the ship into service and trying to achieve the benefits that were originally desired. And because our team and our governance structure was dissolved, there was no kind of mechanism for the issues to be carried on and resolved. So I'd say that's, even though you might think the launch was very successful and we were all very proud of it and everything, but there's still really 2.5 years to go. And I think in some ways we've done the easy bit, and I think the hard bit is still to come.
It's interesting, in building construction, you usually have a maintenance period where the builder, the architect, still is responsible for the maintenance of the building until, say, 6 months in, and then it's handed over to the occupier. We
have the same thing here. We've actually got a 2-year period where the shipyard is responsible contractually to fix faults and make repairs at their own, to their own cost effectively. So that's all built into the program. And again, that's a lesson we learned from the previous project where we only had a year, and some of the technical problems didn't manifest themselves until later. And then we were stuck with having to deal with it ourselves. So now we've got a longer period. So it's another thing we've learned from the last time.
So it's, excuse the pun, but I love puns, it's gone swimmingly. It's on schedule, isn't it? Tell me how you achieved that.
I do like to get on board with your puns, Patrick. I think we've had a little bit of dose of good luck, I suppose. I think there's a little bit of that involved. I think we've had a very stable team. I think that's important. I think my core team of 4 people, we've got one from each decade. That's one of the ways I always say it. We've got a 60, a 50, a 40, and a 30, and I think that's a good combination to have a mix of ages, a mix of experience. I've got commercial, technical, good mix. None of us have left. We're all still here after 5 years, which I guess is a sign of A, a successful project, but B, a good team that stays together and through thick and thin. I think that's really the recipe for it. But also following, almost common sense project management stuff, basic stuff. Get a proper business case which is well written and well understood by people from high and up to the top, and also down to the people who are actually going to be using the ship. Make sure that you get that buy-in from up and down, which I think is, it's quite difficult to do, but I think we've done it well on this project. I think by and large, 95% of the scientists are in favour of the project. There's obviously going to be a few people that don't like it. 2 ships to 1 wasn't popular with everybody, you can imagine. But I think now the naysayers and the people who are anti have either disappeared or have changed their mind, and they see the ship being almost finished. They can see the benefits from it. They can see from a scientific point of view, as Linda said, yes, are we downsizing? Well, yeah, we can't beat around the bush. We are downsizing, but that's done because we want to give BAS more flexibility going forward. So running 2 ships is much more expensive than running 1. that money will go back into mass science, which is going to keep them, future-proof their organisation, let's say.
Mm. Well, I have tracked your progress from the days of the discussion about two vessels or one, and I was there at Birkenhead. Thank you, Linda, for inviting me, and it was just a brilliant day, and I think people should be rightly proud of what's already been achieved. It's been an incredibly good project and incredibly well managed so far. But I'll talk to you a little bit more about that, if I may, Andy, in a moment. I want to come back to you, Linda, and ask about this role you have as head of communications. Andy began by saying that he had two stakeholders, two customers who he needed to satisfy. What's your contribution to that?
Well, my role in British Antarctic Survey is leading the whole communications function to promote and explain the research outcomes and operational activities of British Antarctic Survey to lots of different stakeholder audiences. On this project, I'm the communications lead, and I'm representing not only British Antarctic Survey, but also NERC, that's Natural Environment Research Council, government through the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And now we have another group called UK Research and Innovation. And in addition to that, I'm also representing the communications interests of Camel Laird and their subcontractors like Rolls-Royce.
Wow.
So my job here was to come up with a communication strategy that understood the different stakeholders and the different partners' requirements for stakeholder engagement, and find a way to glue all of that together so that each of the participating partners derived some benefit from their involvement in the project from a corporate communications perspective. So British Antarctic Survey and NERC share a common goal of engaging lots of people in the importance of scientific research. But Camel Laird, of course, as a British shipbuilding company, have a slightly different perspective on that, as do Rolls-Royce and others. So it was finding a strategy that gave something to everyone and determining where the stakeholders that we all had in common. So, I mean, the most important stakeholder from a government perspective is the taxpayer, because it's a £200 million investment in public funds. So there is a big public engagement element to this project. But from the programme governance perspective, Andy and the other people on the governance boards, they have to regularly report back to the government department, the BAES as we call it. Camel Laird has to report back to their board. So one of the strategic objectives for internal engagement, and by internal I mean all of the partners, was that we took this kind of open one team approach. So the shipyard is represented on the governance boards, but we share information equally between one another and try and identify the issues where there might be tensions. So Andy mentioned, we've got a science user community, but we've also got operational people who are trying to plan cruises. And it is quite hard to get a good fit for everybody, and that's what people are focusing on at the moment. But through our communications initiatives, we're getting people talking to one another at the right time. And of course, you very expertly facilitated some of those workshops that brought internal stakeholders together. And we've had other workshops for what we call the science users from British Antarctic Survey and the university community. So there are lots of different pieces in the jigsaw, but from a communications perspective, my job is to try and understand what all of those stakeholder needs are and how do we make the right connections so that the right people are talking to one another at the right time and the right decisions are made at the right time as well. Mm-hmm. And we have a very good dialogue at programme board level, and communications goes to the programme board as well. It's recognised as a function that will enable the successful delivery of the whole programme. Might not have much to do with getting the physical assets off the slipway, but it all helps to join the teams together. So internal engagement is quite a strong component of the overall communications strategy. And then we have our external stakeholders that we have different methods of engaging with and different channels to engage with.
I think some of the work you produce, Linda, is exemplary. I just show up at the workshops and get you talking to each other. But I think what's behind this word communication is you've created a culture of transparency among these different partners. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's good. First of all, thank you for your kind words there. But each of the partners have a different culture in terms of their communications. And the challenge was to try and find the alignment between those cultures and recognize where there might not be good alignment and analyze whether it matters, whether you're aligned or not. So if I give you an example, in the public sector, British Antarctic Survey and NERC, we've got a very strong culture of engaging the public and being open about the things that we do and using all of our scientists and operational teams as ambassadors for all of that. That's slightly different in Camel Laird, where their motivation is very much from the commercial perspective, where you can't necessarily always be open because you would give away your competitive edge. And we wanted to try and have a documentary made about the ship being built, but that didn't align well with the culture at Camel Laird and the risks that they perceived of that being on television. So, but we came to an agreement on it where we respected their position, they understood ours, and we have some compromise over how we achieve media public engagement without compromising their commercial sensitivities or operational challenges in delivering a ship without disruption from film crews turning up. So we're all learning from one another, I think, and certainly from my perspective, it's been really useful to walk in someone else's shoes for a little while and understand the world from their perspective.
Yeah.
In the public sector, we just want to get out there all the time and tell people about what we do, but that isn't the same for other partners. So that's a useful learning point for me.
I would say, Patrick, that the word transparency is important, but I think the even more important word is collaboration. I think to get a huge project like this to be successful, you need so many different people and parties working together, solving the problems as you go along. If you look at the projects which are at the other end of the scale, which have that have gone really badly wrong, you can normally identify the fact that the parties have basically fallen out with each other and they're not collaborating anymore. And you've got to keep that going for a long period of time to have a successful project like this.
I think the fuel that this whole venture runs on is trust. Yeah,
I think so. And it's when you in our team, in our small teams, we had that to start with, so we had an advantage there already. But when we starting to deal with people we'd never met before and companies we'd never met, obviously you have to build that trust. Yeah. And especially on a huge, this is the biggest ship that's been built in this country for 30 years. Commercial ship, obviously there's been some military ships bigger, but so this is a highly risky project for the shipyard. And
I've heard, for example, that people walk the talk, such that some members of British Antarctic Survey have actually moved to the Merseyside area.
That's true, yeah. So this again is a change of strategy for this project compared to the previous one. So this goes back to sort of project management mantra. So going back into the 2000s, where it was zero tolerance to change, basically. So you're saying, right, set the scope of work and then just deliver it without changing it. That was kind of project management methodology, which is quite a good way of doing it. You get things delivered on time and on budget by doing that, by being very strict on that approach. But this time we thought, because there's such a long period between setting the requirement and actually delivering it, in this case 4 years or so, things will change. So we actually allowed some change this time. So we set a budget, maybe 5% of the total budget. We allowed 4 changes, and we prioritized that change. And to make that happen, we needed people on the ground seeing the design as it developed to help make these decisions. So we had a small team of people on site almost from the beginning to say, okay, you can choose this or this for this option. And let them make that decision so that they get more what they want. So when it comes to the end of the process, they've actually seen and chosen things for themselves, which I think is quite a different philosophy from what you might say traditional project management, where you'd say,
yeah, and actually
fix it and then deliver it. That's the kind of, in some ways, a bit of an old-fashioned way of doing it. But now it's much more, I guess, agile. It's much more evolutionary, much more spiraling into a solution type approach rather than just say define, build.
Yeah, no, this is very interesting because some of the more successful ventures I've seen worldwide have been where organizations from the public or private sector have put aside a significant part of the budget for change.
Yeah.
Now, my question here for you both really is a government that needs to be seen to be very careful with its spending. I can't imagine how you could argue the case for a change budget. It looks, in some people's eyes, like a waffle factor, like, oh, you're not very good at estimating and so on.
I think there's a difference between what you might say change and contingency. I think contingency, you could say, is just for bad estimating. Okay, you got the price wrong and the cost wrong to start with, so therefore you need some more money to sort it out. Or your scope was so ill defined that you couldn't, that the contractor couldn't understand it, and therefore you're in the business of having to basically fix things and to make it right. Whereas I think a change budget is where you're actually deliberately deciding between to change something between options. Let's say so. A good example is technology. Obsolescence. So in a 5-year period for a ship, especially for a scientific research ship, some of the technology is changing very quickly, and therefore you might have it very well defined in your statement of requirements. But by the time you come to buy that item, it's out of date. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that process? In the past, you would have just said, okay, well, just buy the out of date piece of equipment because that's what it says in the scope of work, and you'd end up basically buying a white elephant. And that has happened a lot in government and private projects. When they take so long to deliver that by the time they're finished, nobody actually wants the thing that was originally envisaged.
Yes.
So I don't think that's an example of weakness. I think that's an example of learning our lessons from previous projects and saying, actually, you do need, maybe the word change budget's not the right thing to call it, but you do need a kind of anti-obsolescence budget so that you're not building
opportunity budget.
An opportunity budget, yeah. So there's two reasons. One is to prevent this, buying something which is old hat. But the second thing, and maybe even more importantly, is that these people in the shipyard are the masters and the engineers who are going to be running, operating this vessel. So when they come to finally turn the key and sail away from Merseyside, all of their decisions over the last 4 years are in that ship that they've made themselves. They've already got a kind of emotional connection with it. Whereas, you look at previous projects where the crew will turn up to the ship having never seen it before. Oh, here's your new ship. Come on a training course. They had no emotional attachment to it, so it takes a long time. It takes probably 2 years for that on any sort of project, really, for the business as usual organisation to sort of buy into the new project. So that's a big change in how we've done it this time, and I think hopefully, I'm certain it will be better.
That's really good. That's really good. Linda, I wonder, I'd like to go deeper with what you said earlier, before we were so rudely interrupted by Andy, about the engagement. There were some things I've noticed that you've done as a British Antarctic survey that are exemplary, but what's the number one piece of advice you'd pass on to someone seeking to guard and enhance the reputation of a project?
Well, it does come back to trust, openness and transparency. There's always things that will go wrong in a project as well as things that will go right. And any person that's involved in communications or engagement needs to examine at the outset what are all the things that can go right and how are you going to exploit those things in terms of communication and engagement. But you need to anticipate what could also go wrong. And that's where this relationship with the project management team is critical, because Andy is very good at identifying potential risk that might come with a reputational element to it. And that's good in terms of planning. There will always be unexpected things, but advice to anyone else doing something like that, give as much time to thinking about how you will deal with things that go wrong. And in my own experience of when things can go wrong, being open and transparent right the way through means that if something does get into the public domain that could be interpreted negatively, you do actually get a more positive hearing from the media and other stakeholders if you flag it up early enough and you're prepared for it and you have a plan to deal with it.
Thank you, Linda. That's really good. Andy, I'd like to come back to you. Now, this is a pretty high-profile government project. Hit the media last month when the hull was launched, and then when the superstructure was put on. How is the UK government rating it at the moment?
Okay, well, this project is in the portfolio of government major projects. So when we got the funding in 2014, as part of the deal, let's say, is that it goes on to the IPA's major infrastructure program.
The IPA?
So yeah, the Infrastructure Projects Authority, run by the Cabinet Office. So it's in the top 200 projects in the country, which will include all the huge military projects, which go into tens of billions, but also the big rail projects such as Crossrail and East-West Rail, the nuclear power stations. So all the big, huge projects that go on in the UK. We've been on it since, I say, 2014, and our rating is Green Amber, which is the best rating actually in the country. There are a few other projects that have the same rating, but there's no project in the country with a better rating, and we've kept that consistently, which is also quite unusual. So normally, you might have ups and downs, you might have a blip in things if things go wrong, but we've managed to stay on track now for 4 years, which is good. In fact, we've just got our review again next week coming up, so we're hoping this is really going to be testing whether or not we are ready. The organisation is ready now to accept the ship, which is going to be going live in a few months' time. Is all the sort of business as usual lined up for this huge change to their organisation? And we know there's some things that aren't quite right yet, and that's kind of in a way what we're hoping to highlight next week, is to get people to start thinking 6 to 12 months ahead now, and work out what's going to be happening to their organisation when their 2 ships get retired.
One of the fascinating features of working with the British Antarctic Survey is you've got a very seasonal operational cycle. During the Antarctic summer, a lot of people are absent down in the polar region, down in Antarctica. And so a lot seems to be, you need to hit the ground running between April to, October?
Yeah.
And I guess this is a busy time for you.
In a way, that's true. But from a planning point of view, I think that's made things easier because it's a definite cycle every year, and you can only work in certain periods. Your plan, that gives you a structure to your plan to start with. So we knew certainly for sure when one of the ships had to be retired, because that's a contractual issue. So that date was fixed. It was fixed actually next July, a year from now. That date went straight into the plan in 2013 when we wrote it. So 6 years in advance, we knew that was a deadline. And then that sort of shaped the whole plan from the beginning. That kind of shaped the strategy, which you can only work for, as you say, 6 months a year in the Antarctic. So you have sort of windows of opportunity, and you can kind of plan which window to put things in. And if things go wrong, you obviously have to shift things a whole year to the right. So that's kind of in a way a kind of logic problem, which is it gives you a structure to how normally you wouldn't have that constraint.
Well, I wonder about that, Andy. I think that there are operational cycles in a lot of organisations, but they don't notice them as vividly as you do in British Antarctic.
That's true. But I do think it's quite helpful to have a kind of binary decision. Can you do it in this year or not? Which helps you, it forces your hand when you're doing the planning. I think it makes it easier, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so how many shipbuilding projects have you managed with this glowing track record on this one of Green Amber?
This is only the second one. So my background is managing technical projects, and I've been doing that for 21 years. So I've done, I worked on the congestion charge for 6 years. So I put all the cameras into central London and all the back office software that went behind that.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah. So this is only my second ship. So I think what I would say is that what we've learned from this is that these principles can be applied to any project, not shipbuilding.
This is fascinating because for years I've had project managers say that domain experience is of utmost importance. But you're saying that far more skills are transferable these days.
I think not just these days. I think it's always been so. Actually, that's my view. I think domain experience actually can be a disadvantage because just take the launch, for example, where there was hundreds of people standing. A lot of people were very passionate about watching that ship go into the water. If you look at my face there, you'll see I was quite dispassionate. I was more relieved that it was a success because, from my point of view, it was just another step in the process of delivering this project. Okay, it wasn't an amazing day to see this majestic 10,000-ton lump of metal roll into the water. That was amazing. It was quite an emotional thing. But for me, I don't really have a massive attachment to the ship itself. I'm just keen on getting it delivered. So I think, and having that detachment, I think is quite important. If you've got a lot of domain experience, it's because you're passionate about the subject matter, and that, I think, can cloud your judgment. I think sometimes.
Also, I think a lot of project managers get focused on the deliverable rather than the outcome, don't they?
They do, yes, and I think you need both, and I think it's very dangerous not to realise you need both. Because if you go too far the other way, you forget about the basics, which I think are also important. So you do need a proper project plan. You do need a proper risk log. You do need a proper benefits management strategy. You need all these things. They're kind of almost like hygiene issues. If you don't have some of those, you're probably not going to do well anyway. But as you say, you also need to be thinking of the bigger picture, the vision, the future. What it boils down to, getting through all the management speak, is why are you doing this project? What's it for? And to know what the answer to that is, and not just me, but everybody knowing what's it for and why we're doing it is a challenge. I think Linda would say that's probably one of the biggest challenges, is trying to get everyone to actually realise what the purpose of this project is.
Yeah, the objective, the rationale, the benefits.
Yeah. As you say, these words are all management speak to some degree. Benefits management, I don't like that phrase particularly. I think it turns people off. But if you say why we're doing this, what's it for, write down what it's for, write down 10 things, and then those are the benefits. And some of them are obvious. Obviously, we want to do frontier science. We want to have a ship 20 years more modern than the one we've currently got. It's bound to be better.
Let me put it this way. I'm not just a UK taxpayer, but I'm a grandparent. I have 8 grandchildren. I want to see my grandchildren grow up in a world that's its environment's not going to go to hell in a handbag. And I think the science that this ship can consistently deliver over the long term is going to help focus international efforts in a number of areas.
I think so. I would say it's much more than just the science. I mean, Linda might disagree here, but I would say much more important than the science is this project now. For example, if you go into a restaurant, they won't give you a plastic straw anymore. If you go into a supermarket, they won't give you a plastic bag anymore. That is a result, in some ways, of this project, because the science that it's done has highlighted that the sea is full of plastic bags and straws, and that's caused a public outcry. It's not really the science. It's partly the science, but it's also the fact that it's the rationale of what we're doing, I think, more than the science itself.
Yeah.
And it's changed human behaviour, and it's massively in very short order. A bit like when 20 years ago when they discovered the ozone layer problem, and people threw away all their fridges because they were And so these are the things I think are more important. Plus, I also think that the whole UK capability of having marine science in our portfolio of things, I think, is a good thing for our country, and I think we should continue it.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good. Linda, can I return to you and ask a rather delicate subject? At one point, the naming of the boat that's now called the RRS Sir David Attenborough was put to the British public. Tell us what happened.
Yes. So as I was mentioning earlier, both NERC and British Antarctic Survey are strongly committed to engaging the public in the scientific endeavours in the polar region. And normally when we commissioned a new ship, which doesn't happen very often, the last one was about 30 years ago, there is a small group of people who decide on the name. And historically, that was always on dead people who had a high-profile career, and you named the ship after them. So my colleagues in the NERC communications team wanted to see whether we could engage the public at an early stage in the commission of the ship by inviting suggestions for names. So just doing things differently. And that sounded like a good idea at the time. And of course, what they didn't anticipate was the sense of humour that most people have. And we knew, we did have a discussion, and Andy was there, he'll remember. We said, well, what will we do with all the daft names that come in? And we all had a bit of a laugh and said, well, that was inevitable. But what we didn't anticipate really was the volume of public support there would be for a very wacky name like Boaty McBoatface. There were other names on there that I loved, the Polar Roller, out loud, but nobody really thought for a minute that we would choose a silly name for a ship. But the whole process just stimulated an online dialogue and social media storm about the naming of this.
It went viral, didn't it?
It went absolutely viral. And that created a bit of a dilemma for NERC and the government. It created a lot of hands in the air from people at British Antarctic Survey saying, we're not calling our ship Boaty McBoatface. And it really offended some of the mariners and scientists. And it had quite a mixed reaction across the piece. So government stepped in at that point because the minister clearly didn't want to give a frivolous name to a massive piece of investment in a serious piece of kit. And another name that was really popular online was Sir David Attenborough. And so in the end, they chose that name, which I think was a terrific choice. I'd actually voted for that name online. But the compromise was to capitalise on the public engagement in the name, because we suddenly had lots of people talking about a new polar ship that may not otherwise have engaged. We looked at how could you use that name in another aspect of the project. There's a number of things came up, but in the end, we settled on the long-range submersible, which was like a yellow submarine, which in itself has got quite a jolly look about it. And our colleagues at the National Oceanography Centre agreed that they would call the submersible Boaty McBoatface. And what we would try and then do was position the purpose of Boaty for furthering scientific missions. So that's kind of what we've been working on. But the name is just now totally in the UK lexicon of daft zigs and public boats, and we've had Trainee McTrainface and massive other adaptations of that format. So I can laugh about it now. It was quite challenging at the time, and I do recognise some of the benefit that it brought in terms of public engagement. And I think we're getting the Boaty story out there in a nice way that young people can engage with something that looks quite jolly, but it's got a serious purpose behind it, and that's the work that we do.
It's interesting, isn't it? Our best endeavours in engagement can sometimes backfire on us.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting in the way that you have leveraged this, if I can put it that way, because when I told my friends and family where I had been and how proud I was to be there, they didn't connect with the RRS Sir David Attenborough immediately until I said, Boaty McBoatface. And, oh, yes. And they were impressed. They were really impressed. And they wanted to know more.
Yeah.
So these things are a two-edged sword, aren't they, sometimes?
Exactly. It's proven to be a good hook for popularising something that's quite serious. And if you analyse media coverage from which I'm doing at the moment for the Hull and the launch event, the Hull into the Water event, about 90% of the coverage carries the words Boaty McBoatface. but 100% carry the name Sir David Attenborough. And going a bit deeper in there, the science mission, the engineering expertise are very strong messaging that's coming out into the public. So it's been a good way to get people in. The media love the name because they know that it will connect with a popular audience, and that will endure, actually. So
it will.
It's a good thing.
Yeah, and I was particularly impressed with, shall I say, the short speech of Sir David Attenborough himself at the launch event. It was very clear and very engaging, very endearing, but also underlining, Andy, that justification. I'll repent of the word benefits.
Yeah. I think it must be very strange for him to have a ship named after him. It's quite an unusual things that happen. But I do think that it's neatly linked, the ship, with its purpose, because the ship carries his name, and he is, decades of dedication to environmental science. It's neatly linked the two things together, so that people, when they think of Boating Boat Race or they think of Sir David Attenborough and they think of our ship, it all makes sense with the overall story now. And I think in some ways that's been fortunate, but I think we have to capitalise on it. The downside.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry, I was just going to say, you talk about the double-edged sword, which is also true, because if something does go wrong with this project, say there's something goes wrong and everyone in the world's going to know about it, right? Whereas if it had been a kind of private project with no viral publicity, then we would have been able to keep it quiet or cover it up, let's say. But I don't think if something does go wrong, there's no way we're going to be able to. We're just going to have to face it. So that's as you say, the double-edged sword.
What I was going to ask was, tell us a little bit, either of you, about the long-range submersible, and that may be a question that some of the listeners or viewers.
I can do that, because actually, just not coincidentally, but I have also worked on that project. So between the two ship projects I worked on Auto Sublong Range in Southampton, and it is and again another government investment, a large amount of money, I think £10 million originally, and more since, to design marine autonomous robotic systems which can go to places where you couldn't possibly go. So they go right down to the bottom of the sea, 10 to 6,000 meters down. The technology in the last 5 years has increased massively, specifically to do with batteries and satellite technology. So now you can launch one of these things in Southampton, send it to New York, and it will come back on the same battery.
Wow.
And it will take measurements all the way across the Atlantic and back. And so you'd save massive amounts of money and time, and also go places where you couldn't possibly go anyway. So this is the way that marine science is going. You still need big ships to launch these things, but the actual measurements are now being taken by drones and underwater robots.
Wow. So these are underwater drones?
They're underwater drones, and they not only work individually, but the latest sort of development now is they work as teams. So you send fleets of them down in a big arrays, and they work together to cover huge. I mean, one of the statistics about the sea is that we know more about the moon's surface than we do about the bottom of the sea. So only something like 1% of the bottom of the sea has been mapped. For example, we look at that plane that they couldn't find a few years ago. They went and tried to find it. Yeah. They still can't find it. That's how difficult it is to, you think in this day and age, mankind would be able to find that plane, but it's a long way down, and it's basically unexplored. So this is the way forward for marine science, yeah.
Okay, well, before we end this fascinating interview, I'm a big fan of what I call calling out the golden people. I wonder if you could tell us what you most admire in each other. Now, it's usual courtesy to go ladies first, but on this occasion I'm going to break with etiquette, Andy, and ask you to talk about Linda. Can you tell us what you see in Linda and what you admire in her?
Well, I think the overall word I'd use is enthusiasm. I think it's quite rare to see somebody who can maintain that optimism and enthusiasm for such a long period of time, this project and beyond, and deal with it in such a professional way. So you look at things like the media campaigns and the launch event itself, for example, is a good example of something which was very, very professionally handled.
Yeah.
In a way which is done optimistically and enthusiastically. And I think that's the main. And I think if you ask, well, you're probably going to ask her what motivates her, but I think she is dedicated to British Antarctic Survey's cause. I think that just comes through clearly. Is that's what gets her out in the morning and keeps her going throughout the day.
Yeah, I do see an integrity about you, Linda. Would you like to get your own back on Andy now?
Yes, I thought about this as you were speaking there. I'm a big admirer of Andy, and I think the things that I admire about him have come through in this interview with you, Patrick. Andy's professionalism, I think, is wonderful, and I really do admire that in people generally, but it's absolutely exemplified in Andy. And we were talking earlier on about all these different groups that we have who need to be connected, and Andy is the glue that connects all of these people. He understands implicitly what their needs and requirements are, and he can make the right connections, identify the tensions, and help smooth the whole delivery of the project. So I admire Andy's ability to do that. He's got great communication skills. He knows what I need to deliver my part of this project, and he makes sure that I get all of that. And even if we sit in our staff restaurant, Andy will draw me a little sketch that we can then turn into a nice graphic that makes the whole project visible to other people.
That's great. And I'd agree with that. On a teaching point before we end this, I think what's come out of this interview is a complete reversal of the way people used to manage projects like this. You start with the stakeholders and then work from there.
I think so, Patrick. I think it's. I think I'll be wary about saying complete reversal. I think it's more of a building on traditional techniques, but doing things in a slightly better way. So I think, I do think that the basics still need to be done properly.
Of course, yeah. Thank you both very much for such a fascinating conversation and the insights that you've shared with us over the last few minutes. I've really appreciated it. So thank you both very much.
Thanks, Patrick. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.